What if everything you thought you knew about this family was carefully controlled until one voice finally broke the silence and exposed it all? And trust me, what comes next changes everything. So make sure you hit subscribe right now, because the truth you are about to hear is something you do not want to miss. If you have followed this family for any amount of time, you already know that the story presented to the public has always felt carefully shaped, almost too polished to be completely real. And over the years, viewers began to notice small cracks, moments that did not quite align with the image being projected, moments where the emotions felt rehearsed, the conversations felt guided, and the outcomes felt predetermined. But those cracks were easy to overlook because the larger narrative was compelling. It was built on the idea of unity, resilience, and a unique lifestyle that fascinated audiences and kept them invested. Yet behind that carefully constructed image, there were always deeper tensions, quietly building beneath the surface. Tensions that could not be fully hidden no matter how much effort was put into controlling the narrative. And as time went on, those tensions grew stronger, more visible, and more difficult to ignore, especially as the family dynamic began to shift in ways that could not be easily explained or justified within the original storyline. And this is where the situation begins to take a dramatic turn, because when a narrative relies heavily on control, consistency, and perception, any disruption to that control can create a ripple effect that impacts everything. And that is exactly what happened when the one person who had consistently tried to maintain peace and understanding within the family reached a point where staying silent was no longer possible. This individual had always been seen as the bridge, the one who could move between different sides without escalating conflict, the one who could listen without judgment and respond with empathy. But even the strongest bridge can only take so much pressure before it begins to crack. And when that crack finally appeared, it did not come in the form of anger or confrontation. It came in the form of calm, measured honesty, which in many ways was far more powerful because it could not be easily dismissed or discredited. It did not rely on emotion alone. It relied on lived experience and quiet observation, and that made it incredibly difficult for anyone to challenge without drawing even more attention to the inconsistencies that had been building for years. And as soon as those words were spoken, the entire dynamic began to shift, because suddenly the narrative was no longer being controlled by a single perspective. It was being influenced by multiple voices, each adding their own piece to the story. And with each new piece, the overall picture became clearer, more complex, and more difficult to contain. And this shift created a new level of engagement among viewers who began to revisit past moments with fresh eyes, analyzing conversations, expressions, and decisions in a way they had not done before. Because now, there was a different context, a different lens through which to interpret everything. And that change in perspective is significant, because once an audience begins to question the authenticity of a narrative, it becomes nearly impossible to restore the original level of trust. And that is where the real challenge begins, because maintaining credibility requires consistency. And once inconsistencies are exposed, they create doubt. And doubt spreads quickly, especially in an environment where information can be shared, discussed, and amplified across multiple platforms in real time. And as that doubt grows, it creates pressure, not only externally from the audience, but internally within the narrative itself, because those involved must now navigate a situation where their actions are being scrutinized more closely than ever before, and where any attempt to regain control of the narrative must be handled with extreme care to avoid reinforcing the very concerns that are being raised. And this creates a delicate balance, one that is incredibly difficult to maintain, because responding too strongly can appear defensive, while remaining silent can be interpreted as confirmation. And this double bind leaves very little room for effective resolution, which only adds to the tension and uncertainty surrounding the situation. And as this tension continues to build, it begins to impact not just the public perception of the story, but the internal relationships as well. Because when a narrative is challenged from within, it forces those involved to confront aspects of the situation that may have been ignored or minimized in the past. And that confrontation can lead to further division, further revelations, and further shifts in the overall dynamic. And this ongoing process of revelation and reaction creates a cycle that keeps the story in motion, because each new development prompts new questions, new discussions, and new interpretations. And as long as that cycle continues, the audience remains engaged, drawn in by the complexity of the situation and the possibility that because it resonates with viewers on a deeper level. It reflects real human experiences where relationships are complicated, where perspectives differ, and where truth is not always comfortable, but is ultimately necessary. And as this authenticity becomes more apparent, it further challenges the original narrative because it highlights the contrast between what was presented and what is now being revealed. And that contrast raises important questions about the nature of storytelling, the role of perception, and the impact of control on how stories are told and received. And as viewers continue to engage with these questions, they become more invested in the outcome, not just in terms of what will happen next, but in terms of what it all means and how it changes their understanding of everything that came before. And this deeper level of engagement is what sustains interest over time, because it transforms the story from a simple sequence of events into a complex exploration of relationships, communication, and the balance between public image and private reality. And as long as that exploration continues, the story remains relevant, dynamic, and compelling, drawing viewers back again and again as they seek to piece together the full picture from the fragments that are being revealed. And as each fragment is added, the narrative evolves, becoming richer, more nuanced, and more reflective of the complexities that define real-life experiences. And it is within this evolving narrative that the true impact of the situation can be felt, not just as entertainment, but as a reflection of the challenges that arise when control is prioritized over transparency and when perception is valued more than authenticity. As the situation continues to evolve, the ripple effects of that single moment of honesty begin to expand far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Because once a narrative starts to shift, it rarely does so in isolation. Instead, it triggers a chain reaction where each new perspective encourages another voice to emerge, and each voice adds depth, complexity, and nuance to a story that was once presented as simple and unified. And this growing collection of perspectives begins to form a pattern, one that is increasingly difficult to ignore because it highlights recurring themes, recurring inconsistencies, and recurring experiences that challenge the original version of events. And as these patterns become more visible, they invite deeper analysis from viewers who are now actively piecing together information, comparing past statements with present revelations, and identifying connections that may have gone unnoticed before. And this process of active engagement transforms the audience from passive observers to participants in the narrative itself, because their interpretations, discussions, and reactions contribute to the overall direction of the story, influencing how it is perceived and how it continues to unfold. And this shift in audience role is significant because it reduces the effectiveness of traditional narrative control strategies where a single perspective could guide interpretation, and instead creates a more decentralized dynamic where multiple viewpoints coexist and compete for credibility. And in such an environment, authenticity becomes the most valuable currency because it is the one factor that cannot be easily manufactured or sustained without consistency. And as more unfiltered accounts begin to surface through independent platforms, conversations, and personal reflections, the contrast between curated narratives and lived experiences becomes even more pronounced, creating a sense of urgency around uncovering the full truth and understanding the motivations behind the discrepancies. And this urgency drives further exploration, further questioning, and further engagement, which in turn sustains the momentum of the story, keeping it at the forefront of public attention. And as this momentum builds, it begins to impact not only perception, but also practical aspects of the situation, including professional opportunities, financial stability, and long-term viability of the narrative as a form of entertainment. Because when audience trust is compromised, it directly affects their willingness to invest time, energy, and attention. And in an industry that relies heavily on sustained engagement, this can have significant consequences. And as those consequences begin to materialize, they create additional pressure on those at the center of the story to respond, adapt, or reconsider their approach. And each of these options carries its own risks, because responding too aggressively can reinforce negative perceptions, adapting too slowly can result in further loss of relevance, and reconsidering the entire approach requires acknowledging issues that may have been previously denied or minimized. And this complex decision-making process unfolds largely behind the scenes, but its effects are visible through subtle changes in communication, tone, content, and strategy, which viewers are quick to notice and interpret as further evidence of the ongoing shift. And this creates a feedback loop where every action is analyzed, every statement is scrutinized, and every silence is filled with speculation. And while speculation can sometimes lead to exaggeration, it also reflects the level of interest and investment that the audience has in the story, because they're not simply consuming content, they are trying to understand it, to make sense of conflicting information, and to arrive at their own conclusions based on the available evidence. And this analytical approach adds another layer of depth to the narrative, because it encourages critical thinking and fosters a more interactive relationship between the story and its audience. And as this relationship continues to develop, it reinforces the idea that the narrative is not fixed, but fluid, capable of evolving in response to new information, new perspectives, and new interpretations. And this fluidity is both a strength and a challenge, because it allows the story to remain dynamic and relevant, but also makes it more difficult to control or predict. And as a result, those involved must navigate an environment where flexibility, adaptability, and transparency are increasingly important qualities, while rigid control and scripted consistency become less effective and potentially counterproductive. And this shift in narrative dynamics reflects broader changes in how stories are consumed and shared in the digital age, where audiences have greater access to information, greater ability to communicate with one another, and greater influence over the success or failure of a narrative. And within this context, the current situation serves as a compelling example of how quickly and dramatically a story can change when new voices are introduced and when those voices resonate with the audience in a meaningful way. And as we continue to observe this unfolding process, it becomes clear that the outcome will not be determined by a single event or decision, but by the cumulative effect of many factors, including the authenticity of the accounts being shared, the responsiveness of those involved, the engagement of the audience, and the broader cultural context in which the story exists. And all of these factors interact in complex ways, shaping the trajectory of the narrative and influencing how it is ultimately remembered and understood. And as this trajectory continues to develop, it raises important questions. And this open-ended nature is what sustains long-term interest, because it acknowledges that there is always more to learn, more to understand, and more to consider. And as long as that sense of possibility remains, the story retains its relevance, its impact, and its ability to engage audiences in a meaningful and lasting way. And just like that, the truth reshaped everything we thought we knew, leaving a story that can never go back to what it was before. So if you want the real updates and the next shocking reveal, make sure you hit subscribe right now, because this story is far from over.